The weeping voice killer. Serial killers typically do everything they can to remain undetected. They don't want to attract the attention of society or the police because their goal is to keep killing for as long as possible. The better they are at moving in the shadows, the more successful they become. They refine their method of working, learn to erase traces, choose victims more carefully, and the act of killing becomes something almost intimate, personal, something they don't want to share with anyone. But there's another profile, those who crave attention. Narcissistic exhibitionist killers who enjoy seeing their name in the news. Some even kill in part for exactly that reason, to become a famous monster. Cases like the Zodiac Killer or the Son of Sam are clear examples. And then there's a much rarer group, serial killers who seem to be at war with themselves. They aren't those cold, calculating predators who plan everything down to the last detail, but rather people whose minds are in complete turmoil, experiencing psychotic episodes or mental disorders that lead them to act erratically, impulsively, and brutally. This instability causes them to lose control and at the same time make more mistakes. They don't have the strength to stop, but it's as if part of them wants to be caught. They leave clues, attack in front of witnesses, send strange messages, or even call the police. And that's where today's protagonist comes in. Paul Michael Stephani, better known as the Weeping Voice Killer. A guy who called 911 crying, confessing what he had just done, and begging to be stopped. The birth of a repentant monster. The term serial killer began circulating in criminology in the mid-1970s, but it wasn't until 1981 that the US media started using it extensively. One of the cases that exploited collective fear was that of Wayne Williams, the Atlanta child killer. From that point on, people looked at every homicide differently. What if it's another serial killer? In that context, in the city of St. Paul, Minnesota, a very different kind of criminal was about to emerge. January 1st, 1981, the first call. Around 3 a.m. on January 1st, 1981, 911 received a call. On the other end of the line, a hysterical, completely broken voice warned that something very serious had happened near the train tracks. The guy hung up without saying who he was. The police initially treated it almost as if it could be a bad New Year's prank, until they arrived at the scene. They found a young woman almost naked lying in a huge pool of blood. Her skull had been crushed with a blunt object, her neck was stabbed, and the scene was horrific. Against all odds, she was still alive, so they rushed her to the hospital. The victim's name was Karen Potak. She was 20 years old and a college student. She had spent the night partying with friends, had drunk heavily, and went out alone in the early morning hours. Someone caught her in that vulnerable state, repeatedly beat her on the head and face, stabbed her in the neck, and sexually assaulted her. She survived, but her brain was so severely damaged that she remembered absolutely nothing about what had happened. She couldn't help the investigation. The only truly strange thing about the case, aside from the brutality, was that anonymous 911 call. Was the caller the attacker? A witness? The only thing that was clear was that he sounded utterly devastated. June 3rd, 1981, the second victim. 5 months later, on June 3rd, 1981, 911 rang again. Once more, a crying, highly distressed voice spoke of a stabbed woman. He gave no clear details about where the body was located. Then he hung up. Half an hour later, some teenagers found a body on a trail in West River Park. It was a girl lying face down among some bushes wearing a red jacket. Her name was Kimberly Compton. She was 18 years old. She had 61 stab wounds on her chest and stomach, made with something sharp, and a cord tied around her neck. She had arrived in Minnesota that same day by bus from Wisconsin, seeking independence and looking for work. Several witnesses reported seeing her at a bus station, then at a restaurant, talking to a man around 40 years old with a mustache, dark hair, and about 5 feet 11 inches tall. The police, who initially had nothing solid, suddenly connected the dots. In the 911 call, the unknown caller said he had killed someone with an ice pick, and everything indicated that Kimberly's wounds had been inflicted with that type of weapon. It was too much of a coincidence. Conclusion: the caller was the killer. He cried, confessed what he had done, and then hung up. But back then, tracing a phone booth call in less than a minute was nearly impossible. 2 days later, on June 5th, the same guy called again. Between sobs, he confessed to Kimberly Compton's murder. This time the call lasted a bit longer and they managed to locate the phone booth. They collected fingerprints, but of course half the neighborhood had used that phone. Another dead end. On June 11th, 911 rang again. The same voice crying. He blamed himself, said he didn't want to keep killing, that he couldn't bear the thought of going to jail, that he would take his own life if imprisoned. But even so, he remained on the streets. Experts compared the recordings of the different calls and confirmed it was the same person. The police gave him a nickname, the Weeping Voice Killer. They broadcast the recordings on radio and television, hoping someone would recognize the voice, but no one called. The fact that such a distinctive voice wasn't recognized by anyone was incredibly frustrating for the officers. A macabre detail: the color red. Comparing the cases, police detected a pattern. The killer seemed to target young women wearing something red. They didn't know if it was coincidence or something symbolic to him, but it was all they had, so they alerted the public and used that detail to keep interest in the case alive and try to prevent further attacks. False leads and a suspicious silence. In August 1981, another violent case shook St. Paul. A man named Alan Lopez took his father, mother, and sister hostage. Police and a SWAT team surrounded the house. The situation ended in tragedy. Lopez killed his entire family before being apprehended. During the standoff, he claimed to be Kimberly Compton's killer. This prompted investigators to move quickly. But his voice didn't match the weeping voice, and there was nothing solid linking him to the crimes. In 1982, he committed suicide in prison. Interestingly, after Lopez's arrest, no further calls were received from the weeping voice killer for some time, leading some to think he might have been telling the truth. But veteran detectives weren't buying it. They believed the real killer was still out there. August 1982, the body on the riverbank. On August 6, 1982, in Minneapolis, across the Mississippi River, the body of a woman was found stabbed more than 40 times with a screwdriver. There were hardly any clues and no identification. 2 days later, 911 received another call. The same voice crying, saying he had stabbed a woman multiple times. He hung up on the operator again. The victim was identified as Barbara Simons, 40 years old. Several witnesses said they saw her on the night of August 5th at a bar called Hexagon, accompanied by a man with a mustache, dark hair, and who looked to be about 40 years old. Before leaving, Barbara told a waitress that this man would take her home. Once again, everything fit. Woman, extreme violence, crying phone call, unusual weapon, in this case, a screwdriver. But they still had no name or surname. A crucial question arose here. The killer was crying, saying he was sorry that he didn't want to keep killing. But he wouldn't turn himself in, he wouldn't stop, and he kept selecting victims. Furthermore, he began mentioning details that had appeared in the press, like the red clothing, something he had never mentioned before in his calls. So many investigators began to think that rather than remorse, what he was seeking was to make sure everyone knew those crimes were his. The key piece: a survivor. The waitress at the Hexagon bar helped police with something crucial. In a photo lineup, she pointed to the picture of a 37-year-old man named Paul Michael Stephani as the guy who was with Barbara that night. Stephani had a record for aggravated assault, so his photo was on file. Furthermore, he had worked for years at Malberg Manufacturing Company, very close to where Karen Potak was attacked on January 1st, 1981. The police put him squarely on the suspect list, but they still didn't have anything definitive. That would change on August 21st, 1982. That night, a 21-year-old sex worker named Denise Williams was brutally attacked with a screwdriver inside a client's car. She received approximately 15 stab wounds to the chest and stomach, but managed to escape the vehicle and call for help. She miraculously survived. She recounted that the man picked her up on a busy Minneapolis street and took her to his apartment across the river in St. Paul. The sexual encounter lasted only seconds, and afterward he promised to take her back. But instead, he took a strange detour. They ended up in an alley, and that's where he attacked her. She spotted an empty beer bottle, defended herself, smashed it over his head, embedding glass shards in his face, and yet he kept stabbing her. But Denise managed to open the door and get out. A witness heard the screams and saw a bloodied man with a screwdriver in his hand chasing her. The guy fled in his car. Denise's description was clear. A man around 40 years old, 5 feet 11 inches tall, with a mustache, tan skin, somewhat bald and stocky. Police called all the hospitals in the area asking about a man who came in that night with cuts to his head and face. And a name came up, Paul Stephani, who had called 911 saying someone attacked him with a bottle while he was walking down the street. The wounds he had matched perfectly with what Denise described. They showed the young woman several photos of criminals, and when she saw Stephanie's, she had no doubt. That was her attacker. They arrested him immediately. Face to face with the weeping voice. With Stephani now under arrest, investigators interrogated him. At first, he appeared calm, spoke softly, and was very respectful, as if he wanted to cooperate. But when they showed him photos of Kimberly Compton and Barbara Simons and mentioned their names, something broke. He stood up, started screaming, crying hysterically, saying he was innocent. The officers froze. That high-pitched, tearful voice. It was the same one they'd been hearing for months in the 911 recordings. There was no doubt left in their minds. They were face to face with the weeping voice killer. Who was Paul Michael Stephani? Paul Michael Stephani was born in Austin, Minnesota on September 8, 1944, into a middle-class, deeply religious Catholic family with 9 siblings. When he was 3 years old, his mother remarried a very strict stepfather who used to beat the children. There aren't many details about his childhood, but it's known that he was diagnosed with epilepsy in his teens. He doesn't appear to have been particularly violent at that time, at least not outwardly. In his adult life, he held a string of mediocre jobs as a janitor in similar positions, but was fired time and again for irresponsibility. He had mental health problems and was hospitalized several times in psychiatric facilities. He suffered panic attacks and blamed everything on his epilepsy. In 1970, he married a woman named Beverly, with whom he had a daughter. In 1975, she filed for divorce and Stephani disappeared from their lives. He never saw her or the child again. He then began another relationship with a Syrian woman. But in 1977, she left him and returned to her country to marry another man in an arranged marriage. Everything piled up for Stephani. He couldn't find a stable or well-paying job. He lost his wife. Then his new partner abandoned him. He got a job at Malberg Manufacturing Company, but was fired at the end of 1980. Right when the attacks on Karen Potak began, and later the other crimes. Before all this, he had already assaulted a woman on the street and was arrested for it, which left his name and photo in police records. Years later, that detail would be key to identifying him. The trial and a bucket of cold water. The case against Paul Stephani rested primarily on witnesses who saw him with Barbara Simons at the Hexagon Bar, the survivor Denise Williams, who identified him as her attacker, and of course the 911 calls, with that tearful voice and the confessions. Furthermore, his ex-wife and one of his sisters listened to the tapes and confirmed that the voice was his. But in a rather frustrating turn for investigators, the judge decided that the 911 recordings could not be used as conclusive evidence. The voice experts couldn't say with 100% certainty that it was Stephani, and the judge didn't want to take the risk. Result: he was only tried for the murder of Barbara Simons and the attempted murder of Denise Williams. Stephani pleaded not guilty, and his defense attempted to play the insanity card, claiming he heard voices ordering him to kill. Psychiatrists evaluated him and ruled out schizophrenia. In 1984, he was convicted of Barbara Simons' murder, 40 years in prison. In 1985, he received another 18 years for the attempted murder of Denise Williams. The police, meanwhile, were left with the feeling that justice had fallen short. They were convinced he was also responsible for the attack on Karen Potak and the murder of Kimberly Compton. But they didn't have enough evidence to connect everything in court. 1997. Cancer, death near, and confession. Years passed. Media interest in serial killers exploded in the United States, and the Weeping Voice Killer's calls were broadcast repeatedly on radio and television. Although he wasn't officially classified as a serial killer based on the number of proven victims, his case remained etched in the public consciousness. In December 1997, while in prison, Stephani was diagnosed with very advanced skin cancer. Doctors gave him only a few months to live. Knowing the end was near and that he had nothing left to lose, he asked to speak with the St. Paul police. He said he wanted to confess more things in exchange for something as simple as being shown a photo of his mother's grave. She had died while he was incarcerated. In that confession, Stephani admitted that he was the one who savagely attacked Karen Potak on January 1st, 1981. He beat her with an iron bar, cut her throat with a knife, and raped her. That he stabbed Kimberly Compton 61 times with an ice pick in June of that same year, and strangled her with a cord to make sure she died. That he met Kimberly just 15 minutes earlier at a restaurant and offered to show her around the city before attacking her. That he made all the 9/11 calls himself because he knew what he was doing was wrong and felt remorse. But he couldn't stop. He recounted that after killing some of the victims, he spent hours crying and praying inside a church, trying to get God to forgive him. Regarding choosing women in red clothing, even he was unable to provide a logical explanation. But the most disturbing revelation was another confession. He said that in July 1982, he entered a house in the city of Lauderdale and found a woman in the bathtub. According to his account, without being able to explain why, he held her head underwater until she drowned. At first, no one believed him. The modus operandi didn't fit with the others, and it wasn't recorded as a murder. But when investigators reviewed files, they found the case of Kathleen Greening, a 33-year-old teacher found dead in her bathtub on July 21st, 1982. The death had been considered accidental. Stephani described the house's interior in such detail that it was impossible he was making it up. Furthermore, his name and number appeared in Kathleen's phone book. It was never clear how they met, but the connection was there. With this, Stephani admitted to attempting to murder Karen Potak, murdering Kimberly Compton, Barbara Simons, and Kathleen Greening, and brutally attacking Denise Williams, who managed to survive. Legally, and with everything now on the table, he could be considered a serial killer. Remorse or pure ego. Many people cling to the idea that Stephani was remorseful. He called 911 crying, saying he couldn't take it anymore, that he wanted them to stop him. But if we look at his actions objectively, things change. He never surrendered. He never stopped attacking of his own volition. And in the calls, he talked more about himself than about the victims. His Catholic upbringing likely instilled in him a kind of religious guilt. He knew what he was doing was sinful. So calling and confessing seemed in his mind a way to ease his conscience. But that didn't make him any less dangerous. Deep down, many experts believe those calls weren't just a way for him to vent. but also to ensure he got attention. He wanted the police to know there was a monster out there, and that it was him. On June 12th, 1998, at the age of 53, Paul Michael Stephani died of cancer in the prison infirmary. His final confessions helped some families find closure and allowed police to solve cases they didn't even know were murders. But they also made something clear. Behind that tearful voice was not a good soul trapped in an evil body. There was a self-centered, dangerous killer, completely incapable of feeling real empathy for the lives he destroyed.
If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button, subscribe, and share it so more people can learn about this case. That really helps me out and allows me to keep bringing you these dark stories about serial killers, bizarre crimes, and shady real-life characters.
See you in the next video.